How many of you can remember the very first time you opened a bank account? It can be traumatic or inspiring, as it was in my particular case. I was probably 7 years old, 6, 7, somewhere in there. And my mother wanted to make sure that my sister and I knew at least something about how to handle money, particularly when it came to saving it. And what better way to do that than to open an account in a youngster's name at the local bank? And so that's exactly what we did. Now, I confess I don't know the name of the bank. They're probably out of business by now, through no fault of my own. It was probably Evergreen something. Half of the things in Washington State are named Evergreen, and so it's probably Evergreen National Bank or something like that. It was in this little logging town where we lived, and I remember driving down there. It was actually right across the street from the local Seventh-day Adventist church, and I don't know if there's a connection between that or not, but that's where it was. And we walked in the front doors there. In retrospect, it was probably a very humble building. Almost everything in that little town was humble. But when you're only, when you're 7 years old and you're only this tall, and you walk in and you look around, everything looks big, right? And so they had these vaulted ceilings that were going up and skylights shining down, and it was all very library-like, people kind of humming along. I thought that must be the sound of money, right? This kind of low background noise. People were at that middle table where the pens were. We didn't have pens with chains on them at my house, but there were pens with chains on this table here. People were signing things and then getting in line and standing there. And my mother said, let's go get in line. And so we got in line too, and we stood there. And then it was our turn. And my mother said something like, we'd like to open a bank account in my son's name. Now, this was a new experience for me. I'd never had anything done in my name, except perhaps discipline. And the idea of actually doing something in my name in this big establishment was just, I was awestruck. And so we sat down at one of the little desks there in the corner part of the library section, and it was all very quiet. And finally, the very kind lady that was helping us pushed a paper across the desk and said, would you sign your name here, please? I'd never signed my name for anything before. This was my very first legal document to sign my name, Shane Anderson. Now, I think it took up considerably more space than was allotted to me because my handwriting was not very good back then. Something, like this, right? Shane Anderson, right there. And we left the bank with several pieces of very official-looking paper. If I recall correctly, it took $10 to be able to open a savings account in those days. And I had 12. Where it came from, it must have been my grandparents, because I'm sure it didn't come from us. My mother would give us, I want to say it was like a quarter a week, something like that, for our allowance. So either I'd been saving very faithfully for a long time, or I'd gotten a birthday gift or something like that. But there were $12 in this bank account, and that much I could understand. I read through that one page that listed the total balance in my savings account. $12, and my name was on it. For a poor little boy growing up in the wilds of western Washington State, that was something. I don't remember a whole lot from those days wandering around the little logging town we lived in, but I remember that one very well. And interestingly enough, I had this odd sense of assurance. Let's face it, even if you don't love money, there's something nice about a bank account that has some money in it. Which is why it is so troubling when you attempt to make a withdrawal and find that your bank account is empty. If you have a Bible, I'd like you to turn, please, to page 695, Matthew chapter 17, verse 24. Matthew 17, verse 24. I want us to spend some time in this particular portion. This is our only scriptural stop this morning because the story is packed with meaning even though it is brief. Matthew chapter 17, verse 24, finds us in a part of the world that I am at least somewhat familiar with. Last summer, my family and I were able to go along with some friends to Palestine, to the Holy Land, to Israel. It was an excellent time. This is my wife and daughter dressed in appropriate local garb. This is taken in Nazareth, a largely Arab-run city, and so our ladies were encouraged to dress accordingly so as to not attract undue attention. And so this was us driving around. We put them in the front seat because we thought they looked the most authentic in the car. We spent most of our time in Jerusalem, seeing the old town, etc., and went down to Bethlehem a bit. But we also spent some time up in the north here at the Sea of Galilee. In fact, we stayed in Tiberias there, the city on the western coast. Now, when you come down over the hill into Tiberias, this is the Sea of Galilee right here. This is looking, roughly northeast across the Sea of Galilee. And one of the first things that strikes you is just how far down the Sea of Galilee is from where you currently are. We're coming here from Nazareth, up in the hill country, down into Galilee. I tell you what, the calves on Jesus and his disciples must have been huge. I mean, those hills are steep. It's no wonder to me that they would spend time once they got down to one of the cities there on the Sea of Galilee, probably just to recover from coming down to it, okay? You had to have enough energy to get back up. The Sea of Galilee itself is massive. I realize, the Bible refers to it in some places as, the Lake of Gennesaret, etc. It's more than a lake, in my humble opinion. It is large. Beautiful hillsides and some of the places around there. This is looking down towards where the Jordan River empties out, headed down towards the south of the Dead Sea. This is looking over to the Golan Heights, Syria, Jordan, all those peace-loving places in the world, right up here over there. A good, beautiful place. This is Tiberias over here on the left, a relatively modern city, if in need of a little bit of sanitation. Where we stayed in Tiberias was an excellent spot because you can go to many important biblical sites, including right about there on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee is Capernaum, I should say. And you see the picture, it says Capernaum, the town of Jesus. Now, of course, Jesus was not born in Capernaum. He was born in Bethlehem, and then he was raised in Nazareth, but he spent a whole bunch of time in Capernaum. And Capernaum is one of the best sites, in my opinion, to visit in the Holy Land. And the reason for that is because this is a place that we can point to and say, this is where Jesus walked. There are many places in Israel where people will tell you, this is where Jesus walked. But if you do a little digging, you will discover that actually it's a great place to make money if Jesus had walked there, right? But there's a handful of spots that we can point to and say, without any question mark whatsoever, this is where Jesus was. This is where the disciples were. When Jesus walked along the shores of Galilee, this right here may have been the actual rocks that Jesus walked on. The town of Capernaum today is, by modern standards, in relative disrepair, but by archaeological standards, it's doing pretty well. There in Capernaum, it was a decent-sized town in Jesus' day. You can see the outlines here, the foundations and the walls of the various little houses that would be there. Some of them were more extravagant than others with pillars, etc. To the left here is the synagogue. Now, at some other time, we're going to talk about the miracles that Jesus did in the synagogue there in Capernaum. These walls were almost certainly not up when Jesus was there. However, the foundation, one layer down, is indeed the very one. It dates from the first century. That is the one that Jesus walked on during those days. Now, with that as a little backdrop, let's do a little bit of reading. Verse 24. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" Pause right there. Temple tax. Well, what's that about? None of us pay a temple tax today, much less pay anything in drachmas. What is this temple tax about? Well, it goes like this. Every Jewish male that was 20 years old or older was required to pay this tax. Now, I say required. There was no law that was going to come after you and put you in jail if you didn't pay it. But by the norms of the day, tradition said if you are loyal to God, if you are loyal to his temple, which for Judaism at that time was a huge deal, you would pay this temple tax. Now, how much was it? Well, hard to say exactly. It was probably about $150 in today's money. $150. Now, that's not a huge amount, but it's not chump change either. And probably, most of us aren't carrying around $150 in our pockets to randomly fork over here. Peter understandably is concerned about the implied accusation. You say, accusation, what do you mean? The tax collectors asked, doesn't your master, they didn't say does, they said doesn't your master pay this? In other words, we have information, and we consider it to be credible, that your master doesn't pay this tax, and by the way, we know from the chronology of this story, if indeed Jesus had not paid his tax, which it appears that is exactly the case. He did not pay the temple tax. If he didn't pay it, and there was somebody coming now to collect it, Jesus was at least 3 months overdue. So a big sign of your allegiance to God, you're supposed to pay this every year, and you are late, and given all of that, and given the fact that the temple there was not a small thing. In fact, today, if you take a look at the temple, if you go over there to Israel, and you look at the Temple Mount there, this is looking across the way from roughly somewhere above Gethsemane. You don't see a Jewish temple there. You see the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It is a decidedly Muslim institution on top of the Temple Mount. But back in the day, in the first century, it was very, very different. That Temple Mount was not the home of any other particular religious entity. It was the home of the Jewish sanctuary. Now, this is often referred to as Herod's temple. Herod, of course, the ruler at that time, wanted to appease the Jews, and what better way to keep them happy and content than to pay for extravagant materials for their temple. Well, that's what Herod did, and the temple was indeed impressive. There's only a little bit of it that's left today that we can see from the first century. But back in the day, it was incredible. The sanctuary itself, the most holy place inside of this, it was a lavish place, an expensive place. Hundreds and hundreds of sacrifices needed to be procured. The supplies for the priests, the hundreds of priests that would serve at the temple, the Roman soldiers had to be paid. All of this required money. And woe be unto the Jew that was known to have not paid the temple tax. So what is a faithful disciple to do when asked to speak for his master? Verse 25. Yes, he does, Peter replied. As far as we can tell, there was no time, not a lot of thought goes into Peter's answer. Not an unusual thing when it comes to Peter. He doesn't, now I wonder if. He doesn't pull out his checkbook and say, now, did we pay that or not? There's no consulting of anyone else. Just boom. No, my master is faithful. How dare you accuse him otherwise? Of course he pays the temple tax. And I imagine Peter walking away from that conversation with a measure of smugness, knowing that he has just once again successfully defended his master's reputation against his would-be enemies. But I suspect that Peter's smugness lasted only for a moment. We don't know where in Capernaum Peter had this conversation with these temple tax collectors. And by the way, these are not Roman tax collectors. These are Jews. They work for the temple system. We don't know what their business was in Capernaum, but let's just imagine that they're in Capernaum, that they were at the synagogue. That kind of makes sense for a religious bureaucrat. They would be at the religious center of Capernaum. So let's just say they met here on this front portico with Peter. They ask the question. Peter gives the emphatic answer and then decides to head on home. There's a little pathway. You can't quite see it there. It goes this way. And then maybe he turned the corner. This is right next to the synagogue over here. And he's headed down this little path, right, down the center of Capernaum. And then he takes a right turn. You say, well, Shane, why would you say he takes a right turn? Well, they say that Peter's house is right underneath that structure. You say, what's the structure? Well, the Roman Catholic Church considers themselves to be the caretakers for many, many, many of the sites in the Holy Land. So if there is a site, and if Roman Catholicism arrived first, usually standard procedure is to build something over the top of it. Okay, they would say that this is their way of preserving it. Well, they believe that there is evidence that this is Peter's house there in Capernaum. Now, it may not look like much to us, and it may not have been that much of a deal back in the day, but there's an inner room, probably where he stored food. Then there was an outer room around that, another room that went through here, and then an entryway right here. Let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that this is Peter's house. And so if that's the case, Peter is making his way back down the side here. He's headed to the front door of his house. He arrives in his house, and no sooner does he walk in than Jesus has a question for him. Verse 25. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others?" And right here is where I'm guessing that Peter has a severe sinking feeling in his stomach as he remembers something very important about the temple tax. Those of you that have the King James Version, you get a little bit of a stronger feel here for how Jesus is feeling about this. And I believe in the King James and a couple other versions too, it says that Jesus prevented Peter. Now the older English way of using that word prevented is basically, it means you beat the person to the punch. Peter, always willing to open his mouth, right? And Jesus prevents him. Peter walks into the house, and Jesus is right there and basically stops any other conversation, any other topic from being discussed whatsoever. Boom. "Peter, tell me, I have a question for you. What about the son of the king?" And my guess is, just my guess, that it's at this moment that Peter's wheels do start to finally turn, and he realizes he might have been better off if he had thought a little bit more carefully before answering those temple tax collectors, because you see, it was true, yes, it was true in those days that to pay the temple tax was considered to be a sign of loyalty to God, his temple, etc. But there was nonetheless a certain class of people that did not have to pay the tax. 3 groups: Levites, priests, and prophets. Those 3 were exempt, didn't have to pay the tax. In my mind's eye, I cannot help but think that Peter at this point realizes what a mess he has made of things. You see, here's the backstory. This is almost certainly the case. This was not an accidental question. These 2 tax collectors for the temple are here on cue, on target, with a very well done, I must say, an extraordinarily well done trap conceived to get Jesus to condemn himself in some fashion or another. You see, here was the deal. If Jesus were to not pay the temple tax, it would be used by his enemies to show that he was disloyal to the temple. And again, that was a huge deal for Jews. He would undoubtedly lose the trust and confidence of the people. But if Jesus did pay the temple tax, it would be the same as admitting that he was just like any other Jewish man in those days. Certainly not the Messiah, not even a prophet. Because prophets didn't pay that tax. We've got him, they thought. No matter how he answers, we've got him. And sure enough, Peter answers on Jesus' behalf. He takes the bait. And Christ's enemies were probably even now exulting in the fact that by agreeing to pay the tax, Jesus was admitting to be no one special at all. They were undoubtedly spreading the news as far as wide as they could about Jesus' admission that he was no one special. And the only thing spreading in Peter was probably his upset stomach. Finally, he answers rather pitifully at the end of verse 20, at the beginning of verse 26. "From others," Peter answered. Lesson number 1 from this difficult story is that we must be careful what we give God credit for. We must be careful what we give God credit for. Peter was often blessed to speak for his master, preaching, teaching on behalf of Jesus Christ. It was an honor, it was a privilege. But sometime, including here, Peter forgot that speaking for God has some risks that cannot be ignored, and this mistake was costly. And unfortunately, still today, there are Christians that claim to be speaking for God, giving him credit for this or for that, claiming that God promotes, seemingly quotes, good things that actually the Bible makes clear God is not supporting at all. For instance, for decades past and definitely in the present, there are people that claim that Jesus is clearly blessing this political party or that political party. They forget that Jesus does not belong to any particular party or candidate. Jesus is not a registered Democrat. He's not a registered Republican. He's not even a registered independent. Why would you register when you own the universe that the registering takes place in? And while Christians can and should regularly vote their conscience in earthly elections, the real power to change lives is found at Calvary, not Capitol Hill. Furthermore, there are many today that say that Jesus is calling for unity among churches, amongst nations, amongst peoples all over the world, even if that unity comes at the expense of God's truth. But they forget that the only true unity, the only unity that will last, is the unity that is rooted in Jesus Christ and in His Word, the Bible, and not in political correctness or in glossing over rebellion. The list could go on and on. There are people who give God credit for roasting sinners throughout all eternity in the fires of hell. There are people that claim that God changed His Sabbath day from Saturday to Sunday. There are people that claim that the human soul is eternal, thus opening the door for spiritualism and demonic harassment, and yet the Bible clearly shows that none of those claims are true. You see, Peter's fundamental error in this part of the story was assuming that Jesus was oh so much like himself. Peter thought, well, what would I do in this situation? Rather than, what would God do in this situation? And thus, the picture of God that he presented to those tax collectors and to everybody that would now listen to those tax collectors was much more an image of himself than it was of the Almighty. The solution, of course, is humility. And I hate to say it because it sounds almost too simple, but it is oh so true. A careful study of the Bible to see what it actually says about God and who He is. It is a great privilege to be able to speak on behalf of the Lord. But we must never forget that He is God and we are not. May we learn the lesson from Peter's mistake and let the Word of God tell us what God is like rather than our own personal desires or preferences. The story continues. Peter says, verse 26, "From others," Peter answered. "Then the sons are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not offend them, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4-drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." Wow. So many things here, so little time. Look at this first. Jesus says, so that we may not offend them. That is a fascinating statement. So that we may not offend them. Lesson number 2. From this little story here. Choose the hills you'll die on carefully. Choose the hills you'll die on carefully. Let's be clear about this. Jesus was not afraid to offend the religious leaders in Judaism. He probably spent most of his ministry offending somebody in the religious institutions of the day. So he was not afraid of doing that, but that didn't mean that he did it willy-nilly. There was nothing flippant about Jesus, nor was there anything reckless, like might be said of Peter. Jesus instead chose the hills that he was going to die on very carefully. If Jesus had wished, he could have taken these guys on head on. Some of you remember, later on in the book of Matthew, Jesus has these 7 woes that he gives to the religious leaders. I mean, it is scathing. I think Ellen White has the accurate assessment that Jesus did this scathing rebuke of the scribes and the Pharisees with tears in his voice. I mean, this was not an angry rant. This was sorrow. This was extreme sorrow and pain for what these religious leaders, the pain they were causing for his people. And yet when it comes to this temple tax issue, Jesus says, so that we may not offend them. And instead of fighting on this issue, Jesus chooses to smooth things over. Dear friends, the lesson should be clear. Not every point of disagreement with others, even with those who are open enemies of God and his truth, is worth fighting over. Not every issue is a hill to die on. Think about it. There are so many hills that Jesus chose to not die on. For instance, Jesus said very little about the specific political issues of his day. He hardly spoke a word for or against the regional Roman leaders or the emperor, even though the Romans were occupying his people's nation and often treated them cruelly. In fact, Jesus absolutely refused to mobilize the Jews militarily in any way to fight against those Romans. He never supported any local Jewish rebellions, and there were many of them in his day. Jesus didn't even rail against unfair taxes. In fact, Jesus did not directly address many of the social ills of his day at all. And of course, the question comes, why not? Why not? Why didn't he choose to die on those particular hills? And the answer is simple. Because he knew that a frontal assault on such things would have failed to bring about the changes that so clearly needed to be made. You see, Jesus didn't come to save society. Jesus came to save souls. And the difference between those two is massive. And the genius of Jesus, hear it well, the genius of Jesus was that by choosing to primarily spread the gospel rather than fighting social ills, Jesus placed in motion beliefs and thoughts and philosophies that would ultimately undo those social ills anyway. Isn't that amazing? Some people wanted to come straight at the gates of hell, sword in hand. Jesus said, I've got a better idea. Let's dig underneath and wipe the foundation right out from under them. We need to be as wise as Jesus was wise when it comes to these things. Yes, we can strive to bring peace to society, but never at the expense of biblical principle, never at the expense of stifling the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So choose the hills that you'll die on, oh so very carefully. And then the story ends. There is no verse 28. That's it. And I tell you what, if you're reading this through, it's a bit abrupt. Wait a second. Now, the clear implication here is that Peter did as he was told. And because we don't have exactly what happened next, we do know this, that this never comes up again. There's never a time when Jesus' enemies come back and say, you didn't pay the temple tax. So I think we can safely assume that it happened just as Jesus commanded Peter to do. So because we don't have the exact details, let me just use my sanctified imagination to imagine what it might have been like based on other things that we know of the story. Peter, I think, for a moment, is saddened. Once again, probably the other disciples were there in his house, sitting around, doing whatever it was the disciples did in between miracles. I don't know. But they're there, and once again, Peter puts his foot in his mouth. Made a mistake, right? Shouldn't have done it. Should have thought more before I said what I said to those temple tax collectors, but I didn't do it. Messed up again. But then, Peter's a passionate guy. He can be fairly emotional, right? But when he is convicted that something is true, full force, 100%. Off he goes. And my guess is Peter, after he's felt this initial pangs of guilt here, realizes, no, wait a second. I think Jesus just made me the centerpiece of a miracle. I am not going to pass this up. This is good news. I mean, think about it. Jesus just said, we're going to pay the tax, but we're going to do it in a pretty amazing way. Thank you, Jesus. Won't happen again. Off I go. I think, in my mind's eye, I think that Peter makes his way down to the beach, which is only about, maybe, 200 feet from his doorstep, okay, where the beach there on the Sea of Galilee. And by the way, this is the spot right here, okay? And on his way, I think that Peter is not sheepishly making his way down to the water's edge. I think he is gathering people. First stop, the 2 temple tax collectors. Hey, listen, you about the temple tax? I'm going to go make a withdrawal in the bank here. Would you come with me so I can give you the money right away? Oh, certainly, we'd be glad to. And they follow him down there. Peter's collecting people as he goes through town. Hey, come on, I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go fishing here. Why don't you come with me? Oh, Peter, you always go fishing. No, not like today. Come on. It's blazing daylight out there. Peter takes his line and his hook, and in my mind's eye, he's got this little group gathered around him, including those temple tax collectors. And he makes his way to the middle there, and he winds up his hook, right? He throws it out there. Now, you're not supposed to fish in the daytime, right? Because the waters of Galilee are clear. Fish can see you coming, right? But he throws this thing out there, and Jesus said, which fish is it going to be? The very first one. Okay, so this is not going to take long, and Peter's probably doing, running commentary, but just hold tight, just a moment. This will be over in just a little bit. Feels a tug on his line, hooks that fish. He pulls it in by hand, right? And he brings this thing out, and in my mind's eye, he has that fish under his arm, right? And this had to be a reasonably sizable, it couldn't have been a tiny minnow to fit. He had to fit that 4 drachma coin in his mouth, right? He's got this fish under his arm, and it's kind of wiggling and flopping around there. And he goes right in front of the crowd, and he pops that thing's mouth open. And he pulls out a 4 drachma coin. Lesson number 3 from this little story of Peter is that God has ways to provide for us we have not even imagined. Think how involved this particular miracle is. Think about it. Where'd the coin come from? Okay, my guess is that there's some fisherman out there. He's got coins in his pocket. He just went to market the day before, and he's there and he's hauling in something on the boat, and it falls out in the water. Oh, he says things that fishermen say, I guess, when they drop something valuable in the water. And he's like, I can't believe this. And it's part of God's plan all along. And just the right fish comes along, sucks that thing up, but doesn't swallow it. And at just the right time, and at just the right place, this tiny, tiny, tiny little portion of the massive Sea of Galilee becomes the place where that particular hook on that particular line, with that particular fish, with that particular coin in its mouth, God saw it coming and prepared in advance to provide for the need of the hour. In my mind's eye, I picture Peter taking that coin, dripping wet and a little bit slimy, and going over to those tax collectors and saying, now how much was that again? How much did you need? And reluctantly them putting their hands up and saying, because in paying the tax in this way, no one could say that Jesus was anything less than a prophet of God. God has ways that we have not even imagined to provide for us. Peter has just made this withdrawal from Christ's own bank account. And an incredible thing transpires that nobody else could have thunk up. And it reminds us that God's bank account never runs dry, even if ours does. So let me ask you, what is it that you need this morning? I'm not asking necessarily what you want. God is interested in our wants, it's true. But I'm asking this morning, what is it that you need? What is it that you need today that you do not have? The fact of the matter is that most people, you remember that famous old phrase, most men lead quiet lives of desperation. Okay? And I think there's a measure of truth to that. And not just for men, but for women, for children. Too many of us live as unnecessarily needy people. I say unnecessarily. Why do you say unnecessarily? Because we serve a God that has infinite resources at his disposal. And unlike Peter, who went physically to Jesus there at his house in Capernaum, we can't do that, but we can go to Jesus even more easily than Peter could walk into his house. We can pray. We can go to Jesus and in prayer pour out the needs of our heart and say, God, I am at your mercy. Please pour out the blessing that you have promised for your children. In the January 29, 1953 edition of the Review and Herald, there was this quotation. It says, prayer is the answer to every problem in life. It puts us in tune with divine wisdom, which knows how to adjust everything perfectly. So often we do not pray in certain situations because from our standpoint, the outlook is hopeless. But nothing, how much? Nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is so entangled that it cannot be remedied. No human relationship is too strained for God to bring about human reconciliation and understanding. No habit so deep-rooted that it cannot be overcome. No one is so weak that he cannot be strong. No mind is so dull that it cannot be made brilliant. Whatever we need, if we trust God, he will supply it. If anything is causing worry or anxiety, I love this next part, let us stop rehearsing the difficulty and trust God for healing, love, and power. You know why I like that last part, don't you? It is the human temptation. Let me tell you how bad things are. I've got this woe. I've got this problem. Oh, you won't believe it. You know, this thing is wrong in my life. Oh, how I wish it was different. I need it to be different. That's the easy part. Anybody, myself included, can complain. But here the author says, let us stop rehearsing the difficulty and instead trust God, because he is the one above all others that has promised healing and love and power. What is it that you need this morning? I want to challenge you. If you're rehearsing the difficulty, stop. And instead go to God and pour out your heart. And the one who has an unfailing bank account will fulfill your need. In this life, we must be certain that we represent God as he is rather than as we are. And we must choose our battles carefully. And when in the course of our failures or successes or whatever we find ourselves in need, let us come boldly to make whatever withdrawals we need from Christ's own bank. And listen carefully, it's the only bank of its kind that lends without requiring repayment, that opens accounts for people who have no money, and that pays interest rates that are so incredibly high they can only be described as being out of this world. I was so pleased as a young boy to open that earthly bank account. But how much better it is to have a heavenly account in Jesus Christ. Praise the Lord for his abundant, overflowing provision for his children. Amen. Jesus, we thank you that you are indeed our Lord and our light. You take the darkness of our great neediness and dispel it such as no one else can. I pray, Lord, that for all here that are in need, that can hear my voice right now, that they would be inspired afresh to turn to you, the one who knows our needs and who longs to fill them. We thank you for this great gift of your provision, and we pray it in your name. Amen.